The deck rolled under my boots, and I braced against the starboard rail to keep the camera steady. Third time this month, I'd chartered the Sally Ann out of Newport, and Captain Mercer was starting to ask questions I couldn't answer. "You seeing what you need?" he called from the wheelhouse. I lowered the camera. "Yeah, give me another 20 minutes. The smell hit hardest when the wind shifted, that thick, wrong stench of decay happening too fast in cold water. I'd documented pollution events before, spent 2 weeks in the Gulf after the Deepwater spill photographing oiled pelicans and suffocated sea turtles, red tide blooms off the California coast, agricultural runoff choking the Columbia River estuary. This was different. I raised the camera again and fired off another series of shots, trying to capture the scope of it. The circular pattern stretched from horizon to horizon in every direction the eye could follow. Had to be 2 miles across, maybe more. Perfectly circular. That's what kept snagging in my mind, that geometric precision. Nature didn't work in circles this clean. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands, probably. Rockfish mostly. Black rockfish, yellow eye, canary rockfish with their distinctive orange markings dulled in death. Pacific hake mixed throughout, their silvery bodies catching the afternoon light. All of them belly up, rotating slowly in the current. I'd seen fish kills before. They spread in irregular patches, following current patterns and concentration gradients. Toxins dispersed unevenly. Algae blooms followed coastlines and nutrient upwellings. This perfect circle sitting in open water 40 miles offshore made my hands want to shake while I worked the camera controls. Captain Mercer cut the engine. The Sally Ann drifted into the dead zone's outer edge, and the gentle slap of waves against the hull changed texture. Softer, muffled by all those bodies. "Jesus Christ," Mercer muttered. He'd come out of the wheelhouse without me noticing. "Never seen anything like this." "Me neither." "And you've seen a lot of weird shit, haven't you?" I had. Marine biology didn't usually involve geometric patterns of mass death in deep water. I pulled on nitrile gloves and grabbed the telescoping net from where I'd stowed it along the rail. Needed specimens. Photographs documented the pattern, but they wouldn't tell me what had killed these fish. The first rockfish I netted was a black rockfish, maybe 14 inches long. Fresh dead. The eyes hadn't clouded yet, and the flesh was still firm when I pressed my thumb against its flank. I laid it on the plastic tarp I'd spread across a section of deck, and selected a hake next, then a yellow-eye rockfish with brilliant orange markings. Mercer watched me work. "What are you looking for?" "Don't know yet." I pulled out my field kit and started with external examination. No obvious lesions. No discoloration beyond normal species markings. Gills looked healthy. No sign of the hemorrhaging you'd see with certain toxins. I checked their mouths, their fins, ran gloved fingers along their lateral lines feeling for abnormalities. Nothing. The dissection knife came out. I'd done this hundreds of times. Thousands, maybe. Undergraduate work studying parasitic load in commercial fishing zones. Graduate research on environmental stressors. Postdoc work tracking contamination bioaccumulation. My hands knew the movements. I opened the black rockfish's body cavity with a clean ventral incision and peeled back the flesh. Shit. What? Mercer leaned closer. The swim bladder had ruptured. Not just punctured or deflated. Ruptured violently. The tissue torn and hemorrhaged. I'd seen barotrauma before in fish brought up too quickly from depth, their swim bladders expanding catastrophically as pressure decreased. This looked the same. Massive pressure differential trauma. Except we were drifting in 40 feet of water. I checked the hake. Same thing. Swim bladder completely destroyed. Surrounding tissue damaged from the internal rupture. The yellow-eye rockfish, showed identical trauma. My mind started cycling through possibilities, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Rockfish had closed swim bladders. They couldn't quickly adjust their buoyancy like fish with open systems. But that didn't matter. Nothing about swim bladder physiology explained this kind of catastrophic failure in shallow water. "What killed them?" Mercer asked. "Pressure change. Like they got dragged down to crushing depth and brought back up too fast." "In 40 feet of water?" "Yeah. That's not possible." "I know." I photographed the dissected specimens, measured the extent of the tissue damage, collected samples in preservative solution. The scientist part of my brain was cataloging observations, recording data. The rest of me was trying not to think about what could cause pressure trauma like this across a perfect circle 2 miles wide. The sun was dropping toward the horizon when I finally packed up my gear. Mercer took us back to Newport without much conversation. He knew weird when he saw it, and he'd seen enough. The second dead zone appeared 6 days later, 70 miles north of the first. A commercial fishing crew reported it, thought they'd found a mother lode of yellowfin tuna based on the bird activity. Found dead fish instead. I chartered a plane out of Astoria and flew over it at 2,000 feet, shooting through the open window while the pilot circled. Same pattern. Perfect circle. Maybe 1.5 miles across this time. Different species mix. More tuna, some mahi-mahi, skipjack. All dead. The third one showed up 4 days after that, southwest of the second. I was back on the Sally Ann by then, and Mercer had stopped asking questions. Just took my money and pointed the bow where I told him. 4 more appeared over the next 2 weeks. I tracked them on the chart in my apartment, pins marking each location. They spread north and south along the coast, ranging from 50 to 100 miles offshore. The spacing seemed random. No pattern I could identify anyway, but every single one maintained that perfect circular geometry. 7 dead zones total. Tens of thousands of fish. Maybe hundreds of thousands. I didn't have the resources for accurate population counts. I spent every spare hour examining specimens, running tests at the university lab before someone in administration noticed and started asking uncomfortable questions. Every fish showed the same swim bladder trauma. Massive pressure differential damage in shallow water. My apartment filled with maps and data sheets and specimen photographs pinned to the walls. I wasn't sleeping much. The pattern meant something. Had to mean something. Nature didn't produce effects this consistent without a consistent cause. I drafted the report on a Tuesday night, working through until the sky started lightening outside my window. 15 pages of observations, measurements, analysis. Photographs documenting the circular patterns. Dissection images showing the internal trauma. Water samples testing negative for known toxins. Temperature and salinity readings showing nothing abnormal. The conclusion section gave me trouble. I didn't have a conclusion. Just a catalog of impossible observations. Emma Fowler's name came to mind around dawn, when I was too tired to second-guess myself. We'd crossed paths at a conference in San Diego 3 years back. She'd presented research on underwater acoustic mapping. I'd been there discussing marine mammal migration patterns. We'd gotten drinks afterward and talked about the overlap between naval research and marine biology. She'd given me her contact information, said to reach out if I ever stumbled across anything interesting in the acoustic space. This wasn't acoustic exactly, but the Navy had sensors all over the Pacific. Hydrophone arrays, submarine detection systems, classified monitoring equipment I couldn't even guess at. If something was happening out there, something causing pressure events violent enough to rupture swim bladders across 2-mile zones, maybe they'd detected it. I attached the report to an email and sent it before I could overthink the decision. Emma's response came back 48 hours later. I'd been checking my inbox every 20 minutes, jumping every time my phone buzzed. The email was 3 sentences long. Andy, received your report. The Navy has no information to share regarding these events. Recommend you direct your inquiry through official channels. I read it twice, then a third time. Official channels meant filing requests that would disappear into bureaucratic black holes. It meant waiting months for responses that would tell me nothing. Emma knew that, as well as I did. I sat back in my desk chair and stared at those 3 sentences. The Navy has no information to share. Not, we haven't detected anything unusual. Not, our monitoring systems show normal conditions. Just a flat refusal to engage. Which meant either they genuinely knew nothing, or they knew something they weren't willing to discuss. My gut told me which option was more likely. I closed the laptop and looked at the maps covering my wall. 7 dead zones scattered across the Pacific. Perfectly circular. Pressure trauma in shallow water. And the Navy had no information to share. I spent 3 days staring at those 7 pins on my apartment wall before I thought to check the maritime traffic data. Should have done it sooner. The university gave me credentials to half a dozen tracking databases for my coastal migration research, access I'd barely touched since the dead zones started appearing. The laptop sat on my kitchen table, surrounded by coffee mugs and specimen logs. I logged into the Pacific Maritime Transit System first, pulled up the vessel tracking overlay for the past 6 months, and let the data populate across my screen. Commercial shipping lanes lit up in bright lines, container ships, tankers, fishing trawlers, all moving in their predictable corridors. Normal traffic, expected patterns. I toggled the military filter. The screen flickered. Dozen of routes vanished. My hand stopped on the trackpad. I sat there looking at empty ocean where transit corridors should have been, where they'd always been according to the historical data I'd reviewed for previous research. I pulled up the comparison view, 6 months ago versus current, and watched the differences highlight in red. Entire deepwater passages had gone dark, not reduced, not rerouted, just gone. Submarine routes that had operated since I'd first accessed these databases 4 years back, routes that probably dated to Cold War patrol patterns, now showed 0 activity. I zoomed in on the corridor west of the Cascadia Basin. Nothing. Pulled up the transponder logs. Last recorded passage was 11 weeks ago, 2 weeks before the first dead zone appeared. I clicked through to the next corridor. Same thing. Last passage 10 weeks ago. My chest felt tight. I pushed my glasses up and leaned closer to the screen, checking each abandoned route against my wall map. The dead zones didn't overlap the old submarine corridors exactly, but they were close, within 20 to 40 miles of where those deep water passages used to run. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. I drank it anyway. I spent the next 6 hours pulling every piece of traffic data I could access. Coast Guard logs, commercial fishing reports, oceanographic research vessel schedules. Built a timeline spreadsheet with 3 columns. Submarine activity, dead zone appearances, traffic pattern changes. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was there. Clear enough that my hand started shaking when I typed the last entry. Something had made the Navy abandon routes they'd used for decades. Something in the water. I needed someone who understood what I was looking at. Someone with experience in deep ocean monitoring, who knew how the military tracked movement beneath the surface. I thought about Emma's 3-sentence brush-off and dismissed the idea of going back to her. The Navy wasn't going to help me, but retired Navy might. Took me an hour of digging through old conference proceedings before I found the name I was looking for. Dr. Gregory Hill. I'd heard him speak at a symposium in Seattle 6 years back. Acoustic monitoring in marine environments, something about historical hydrophone data from Cold War listening stations. He'd been old then, must have been in his late 60s, but sharp. Asked questions during other presentations that cut right to the methodology problems everyone else was dancing around. I found his email through the University of Washington's Emeritus Faculty Directory. Sent him a message at 11:30 at night with my traffic data attached, the dead zone report, and a single paragraph explanation that probably sounded unhinged. Didn't care. I hit send and went to bed with my laptop still open on the table. He responded 14 hours later. Mr. Rose, your data is concerning. I have access to some decommissioned listening arrays that might provide relevant information. Can you come to Seattle? GH. I was on the road in 40 minutes. Gregory's house sat in a quiet neighborhood north of the university, a small craftsman with overgrown rhododendrons flanking the front steps. I parked on the street and grabbed my laptop bag, checking the address twice before I walked up the path. He answered on the second knock. Taller than I remembered, stooped at the shoulders, wearing a cardigan that had seen better years. His eyes went to the bag on my shoulder. You brought everything? Yes, sir. Come in. The interior was exactly what I expected from a retired academic. Bookshelves covering every wall, papers stacked on horizontal surfaces, the faint smell of old coffee and printer toner. He led me through the living room to a back office that had been converted into something between a study and a laboratory. 2 large monitors sat on an L-shaped desk, surrounded by external hard drives and what looked like signal processing equipment I'd last seen in sonar labs. Sit. He gestured to a second chair. Show me what you have. I opened my laptop and pulled up the traffic comparison data first. He leaned forward, put on reading glasses that hung from a chain around his neck, and studied the screen without speaking. His finger traced one of the abandoned corridors. When did this route go dark? 11 weeks ago. And the first dead zone? 9 weeks ago. He made a sound in his throat, pulled one of his keyboards closer and started typing, pulling up something on his own monitors. A map appeared. The Pacific Northwest coast rendered in bathymetric detail, depth contours labeled in meters, small icons scattered across the deep water, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. These are the old SOSUS arrays, he said. Sound surveillance system, Cold War hydrophone networks. Most were decommissioned in the 90s, but the equipment's still down there, still recording. You have access? I helped design some of them. He clicked through several menus, selected 3 icons clustered west of the Olympic Peninsula. These 3 stations are still transmitting to a backup server. Navy doesn't monitor them anymore, but the data stream never stopped. I check them occasionally. Old habit. He pulled up a waveform display, audio data, weeks of it compressed into a visual timeline. Show me where your dead zones appeared. I gave him the dates and coordinates. He marked each one on his map, then started scanning through the audio data, jumping to timestamps that corresponded with the days before each event. The waveforms looked normal to me. Background ocean noise, probably whale calls, the usual chaos of underwater sound. Then he stopped. There. He expanded a section of the waveform, isolated a frequency range, and played it through his speakers. The sound filled the office, a low-frequency sweep that rose and fell in a pattern that made my skin crawl. Deep, resonant. Not quite mechanical, but not quite organic either. What is that? Gregory didn't answer. He was already pulling up another file, something from an archive folder labeled Historical Anomalies. A second waveform appeared on his other monitor. He played it. The same sound. This recording is from 1997. he said quietly. No AA captured it on hydrophones in the South Pacific. They called it the bloop. Made headlines for years until they decided it was probably an ice quake. Ice shelf calving, fracturing, that sort of thing. I looked between the two waveforms. They were identical. Not similar. Identical. Ice quakes don't repeat, I said. No, they don't. He pulled up more data from his decommissioned arrays, scanning through weeks of recordings with the kind of speed that came from decades of practice. Found another instance of the sound, then another. Started building a timeline on a notepad beside his keyboard, writing timestamps in careful block letters. This signal appears 17 times in the past 12 weeks, he said, always in deep water, always west of the continental shelf. Before the dead zones? 12 to 48 hours before. Every time. My mouth had gone dry. I watched him work, pulling up spectrographic analysis, measuring frequency patterns and duration. His hands moved across the keyboard with absolute certainty, but his expression was getting tighter, the lines around his mouth deepening. The 1997 signal was deep, he said. Very deep. Probably originating from near the ocean floor, 2,000 or 3,000 meters down. These signals... He pulled up a depth analysis, calculations I only half understood. These are coming from much shallower water, 600 to 800 meters, and they're stronger. Significantly stronger. Stronger how? The source is producing more acoustic energy. A lot more. He opened another analysis window, showed me amplitude comparisons I couldn't quite parse. And look at this. He isolated 3 separate instances of the signal, played them in sequence. I heard it this time without him having to explain. The pattern. The sound wasn't just repeating, it was varying. Different intervals between the pulses, different durations, different frequency modulations at the end of each sweep. That's not geological, I said. Gregory sat back in his chair. His face had lost color, the deep brown of his skin turning ashen. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes with both hands. No, he said. That's communication. Carrie Harris asked me to close the door. Her office was on the 3rd floor of the Marine Sciences building, windows facing the quad where undergrads crossed between classes in the afternoon sun. She sat behind her desk with her hands folded on top of a manila folder. My report. I recognized the coffee stain on the corner from where I'd set my mug down 3 nights earlier while printing copies. I've reviewed your findings. She didn't open the folder. I need to be clear about the university's position. I stayed standing. Didn't seem like the kind of conversation that needed me to get comfortable. She opened the folder then, flipped through the pages without reading them. Photographs of the dead zones, dissection images showing ruptured swim bladders, the traffic analysis spreadsheet. She stopped on the page showing the waveform comparison between Gregory's recordings and the 1997 bloop. This is fascinating work, she said. Genuinely fascinating. But it's also incomplete, unverified, and... She looked up at me. Potentially dangerous to pursue further. Dangerous how? You're suggesting the Navy abandoned established routes due to an unknown acoustic phenomenon. You're claiming to have detected signals that match a 20-year-old anomaly. You're proposing that something in deep water is communicating. She closed the folder. Without peer review, without institutional backing, this is speculation. If you publish this and you're wrong, the university's reputation suffers. If you continue investigating and something happens to you at sea, we face liability concerns. I'd expected this, had known it was coming the moment I handed her the report. I'm not asking the university to back it, I said. I'm informing you of my research. Research requires approval when it involves field expeditions, especially maritime operations in international waters. Her voice stayed level, diplomatic, the tone she probably used in budget meetings when she wanted to kill a project without seeming unreasonable. I'm advising you strongly to halt this investigation until you can secure proper funding, peer review, and safety protocols. How long would that take? 18 months minimum. Possibly 2 years. I thought about the dead zones, 7 of them already, fish rotting in perfect circles while I filed grant applications and waited for committee approvals. I thought about the signals Gregory had isolated, the pattern that suggested intention rather than geology. I can't wait 2 years, I said. Carrie leaned back in her chair. Then I can't protect you. If you pursue this independently, you do so without university resources, without institutional support, and without liability coverage. Is that clear? Clear. She opened a desk drawer, pulled out a single sheet of paper, slid it across the desk. A liability waiver. She'd prepared it before I arrived. I signed it without reading the fine print. I found Vernon Hamilton's contact information through a graduate student who'd worked on a sediment survey off the Juan de Fuca Ridge. The student mentioned Vernon in passing, said he operated a research vessel called the Meridian, took jobs other captains wouldn't touch. Didn't ask too many questions, if the money was good. I called the number from my apartment that evening. Vernon answered on the 3rd ring. Hamilton. My name's Andy Rose. I'm looking to charter a vessel for a research expedition. What kind of research? Deep water observation, west of the continental shelf. 4 to 5 days at sea. Silence on the other end. I heard wind, the distant sound of rigging clanging against a mast. How deep? Vernon said. 600 to 800 meters, possibly deeper. And you want to do what, exactly? I'd thought about how to explain this. Decided honesty was simpler than trying to construct a cover story that would fall apart the moment we were at sea. I'm tracking an acoustic phenomenon. Something's making noise in deep water, and I need to get directly above the source coordinates. Another pause, longer this time. You Navy? University researcher, independent now. Why independent? Because the university won't back this. I heard him exhale. That's usually a bad sign. Usually, I said, but the money's good, and I'm not asking you to do anything except get me there and back. How good? I named a figure that would drain most of my savings account. Vernon didn't respond immediately, which I took as a positive sign. If he'd thought I was insane, he would have hung up already. When do you want to leave? He said finally. Soon as possible. I need 2 days to prep and provision. You cover fuel, provisions, and equipment wear. Half up front, half when we return. Agreed. Meridian's berthed in Seattle, Pier 57. Be there Thursday morning, 600 hours. We leave at 06:30 whether you're aboard or not. He disconnected before I could respond. I knew Vernon Hamilton had a reputation. The graduate student had been careful about how he phrased it. Said Vernon was reliable in difficult circumstances and experienced with non-standard operations, which meant he'd take jobs that involved risk, ambiguity, or destinations that didn't appear on tourist brochures. I didn't know what he looked like until I saw him on the Meridian's deck Thursday morning. Tall, weathered, salt and pepper hair tied back, squinting into the early sun as I walked down the pier with my equipment cases. He watched me approach without moving, hands in the pockets of a waterproof jacket that had seen better decades. Rose, that's me. He looked at my cases. That everything? Hydrophone array, recording equipment, laptop, backup drives, plus personal gear. No submersibles, no trawling equipment, no explosives. No. Good. Bring it aboard. Marilyn will show you where to stow your gear. The Meridian was a 60-foot research vessel that had probably been white once, but had faded to a gray that matched the morning sky. Functional, not pretty. I could see equipment modifications along the rails, reinforced mounting points for instruments, a hydraulic winch on the stern. Marilyn Munoz appeared from the wheelhouse as I climbed aboard. Shorter than Vernon, muscular build, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She nodded at me, gestured toward the cases. "I'll take those below." "You ever been on a research vessel before?" "A few times. Smaller boats, coastal work. This'll be rougher. We're going outside the shelf. Weather gets unpredictable. You get seasick?" "Not usually." "Good. Your bunk's forward, heads to starboard. Don't touch any equipment you didn't bring. We clear?" "Clear." She took 2 of my cases and headed below. I followed with the rest. Vernon got us underway at 06:30 exactly. I stood on deck as Seattle fell behind us, the city's skyline shrinking into the gray morning haze. The Meridian's engine had a steady rumble that I felt through the deck, and the smell of diesel mixed with salt water and something else. Old wood, rust, the accumulated scent of years at sea. I didn't know if this was the right decision. Didn't know if I'd find anything at the coordinates Gregory had identified. But I knew I couldn't sit in my apartment staring at pins on a map, while something in deep water kept signaling and fish kept dying in perfect circles. So I stayed on deck and watched the coast disappear. 4 days at sea. The Meridian pushed west through weather that shifted from calm to rough and back again. I spent most of the time reviewing Gregory's data on my laptop, checking the coordinates against bathymetric charts, preparing the hydrophone array for deployment. Vernon ran a tight operation. He and Marilyn worked with the kind of efficiency that came from years together, minimal conversation, each knowing what the other needed before being asked. They didn't press me for details about what I was looking for, which I appreciated. Just got us where we needed to go. On the 4th day, early afternoon, Vernon called down from the wheelhouse. "We're here. Your coordinates." I climbed up to join him. Marilyn was already there, watching the sonar display. Vernon had his hands on the wheel, eyes on the GPS. I looked out through the windscreen at the ocean. The water looked wrong. It took me a moment to identify what I was seeing. The color was different, darker than the surrounding sea, almost black in places. The surface had a quality that didn't match the normal wave patterns, something in the way the light reflected off it. Viscous almost. Heavy. "You seeing this?" I said to Vernon. "Seeing something. Don't know what." Marilyn leaned closer to the sonar display. Her fingers moved across the controls, adjusting the range and gain. She went still. "Vernon." He looked over. "What have you got?" "Trench. Directly beneath us." She adjusted the display again. "It's dropping off beyond our range." I moved to look at the screen. The sonar showed the ocean floor descending sharply, the depth numbers climbing. 600 meters, 800, 1,000. The bottom of the display showed only empty black. "How deep does this equipment read?" I said. 1,500 meters, Marilyn said. "We're not finding bottom." I pulled out the bathymetric chart I'd been using, spread it on the console. The coordinates put us west of the continental shelf, in an area the chart showed as relatively flat, abyssal plain. 3,000 meters deep, give or take. No trenches marked. Vernon looked at the chart, then at the sonar display. "That's not on there," he said. "No." Marilyn pulled up a different sonar view, switched to a broader scan pattern. The trench extended in both directions, a gash in the ocean floor that the official charts had somehow missed entirely. She looked at me. "What exactly are we looking for out here?" I stared at the sonar display. at the darkness beneath us that descended beyond measurement, and felt my hands start to shake. "I don't know," I said. "Not anymore." I authorized the deployment. Vernon didn't ask what I expected to find down there, just nodded when I explained I needed a camera system that could reach the deepest part of the trench, told me it'd cost extra for the reinforced equipment rental and the time it'd take. I agreed, paid the additional fee from what remained in my account, enough to cover it barely. The camera system arrived the next morning via helicopter drop. "Military surplus," Vernon said. "Reinforced titanium housing, rated to 40,000 feet, dual floodlights capable of cutting through the darkness at depths where sunlight hadn't penetrated in millions of years." The thing weighed close to 200 pounds without the mounting bracket. Marilyn and Vernon rigged it to the winch on the starboard side. I watched them work, checked the cable myself twice, steel-reinforced composite, rated to 60,000 pounds of tensile strength. The housing looked solid. Clean welds, pressure seals intact, the lens port crystal clear behind its protective dome. I connected my laptop to the camera's transmission system, ran a diagnostic check. Video feed came through clean. Floodlights tested operational. Battery indicator showed full charge, good for 8 hours of continuous recording at depth. "Ready when you are," Vernon said. I gave him the signal. The winch engaged with a mechanical groan. The camera lifted off the deck, swung out over the water on the boom arm, then began its descent. I watched it disappear beneath the surface, the cable spooling out smooth and steady, water dripping from the line as it fed down into the black. I moved to the monitor I'd set up in the wheelhouse. Vernon stood at the helm. Marilyn monitored the winch controls, one hand on the speed regulator. The screen showed blue-green water for the first 100 feet. Shafts of sunlight angled down through the murk. A school of something, looked like mackerel, scattered as the camera dropped past them. 200 feet. The water darkened to navy. 500 feet. Almost black now, except for the thin column of descending light from the surface. 1,000 feet. The floodlights kicked on automatically. Twin beams cut through the water, illuminating nothing but particulate matter drifting in the current. Marine snow, we called it. Organic debris falling in an endless rain toward the bottom. I pulled up a chair, settled in. This was going to take hours. The descent continued at a steady rate, 50 feet per minute, slow enough to avoid stressing the cable, fast enough that we'd reach target depth before the battery died. 3,000 feet. The temperature readout on screen showed 4 degrees Celsius and dropping. 5,000 feet. Pressure reading climbed past 700 pounds per square inch. I watched the depth counter increment. Tried not to think about what I'd spent to get here. What I'd signed away back in Carrie's office. What would happen if this turned up nothing? Vernon brought me coffee around the 2-hour mark. Didn't say anything. Just set the mug down beside the laptop and went back to the helm. 8,000 feet. We'd passed beyond the continental shelf now, into true abyssal territory. The water outside the camera's lights was absolute black. No trace of surface light could reach this far down. The only illumination came from the floodlights and the occasional bioluminescent organism drifting past, tiny points of blue-green fire that flared and faded in the darkness. I logged timestamps in my notebook, recorded depth readings every 1,000 feet. The scientist in me needed the data, needed something to do with my hands while the cable spooled out and the camera dropped and the depth counter climbed. 15,000 feet. 20,000. My coffee had gone cold. I drank it anyway. 25,000 feet. Pressure readings showed over 11,000 pounds per square inch. The temperature had bottomed out at 1 degree Celsius. Nothing lived down here. Nothing could. Too cold. Too dark. Too much pressure crushing down from the miles of water above. Except something did live down here. Something that made sounds Gregory's arrays had captured. Something that appeared before the dead zones formed. 30,000 feet. I leaned closer to the screen. The floodlights showed the same endless darkness, the same drifting particulate matter. The marine snow seemed thicker here, or maybe that was just my imagination. My eyes ached from staring at the monitor. 32,000 feet. 33,000. The camera jerked. Just a small movement, barely noticeable, but I saw it. The image shifted slightly to the left, then steadied. I sat up straighter. 34,000 feet. Another jerk, more pronounced this time. The camera swung on its cable, the floodlight beams sweeping across the darkness like searchlights. "You seeing this?" Vernon's voice came from behind me. "Yeah." 35,000 feet. The floodlights illuminated something. I gripped the edge of the monitor. My knuckles went white against the plastic casing. The shape filled the entire frame. Massive didn't cover it. The thing was enormous, easily 100 feet across just in the portion visible on screen. Bioluminescent patches glowed across its surface, not the simple blue-green of bacterial colonies, but complex patterns that pulsed in sequences, colors I didn't have names for, wavelengths that shouldn't exist in nature. The geometry was wrong. I'd studied marine biology for a decade, knew the body plans, the phylogenetic relationships, the evolutionary constraints that shaped oceanic life. This didn't fit any of it. Curved surfaces connected at angles that hurt to look at directly. The camera's lens showed them clearly enough. But my brain couldn't process the spatial relationships. An edge would seem to recede into the distance. Then the perspective would shift, and the same edge appeared closer than the camera itself. Surfaces that should have been convex looked concave when viewed from certain angles. Not biological. Couldn't be. But it moved with the slow rhythm of something living, something breathing. I realized I'd stopped breathing myself, forced air into my lungs. "What am I looking at?" Vernon's voice was quiet. I couldn't answer, didn't have an answer. The bioluminescent patterns pulsed faster. The shape shifted slightly. A movement that shouldn't have been possible for something that size, too fluid, too coordinated. I watched a section of the surface ripple and understood with a certainty that made my stomach drop that this thing was old. Ancient beyond anything in the fossil record. The Cambrian explosion happened 540 million years ago. This predated that. This predated everything. The surface was covered in growths. At first I thought they were barnacles. Made sense. Deep-water organisms colonizing a larger host, standard ecological relationship. But as the camera's floodlights played across them, I saw the growths pulsing in rhythm with the bioluminescent patches. Each one was roughly spherical, maybe 8 inches across, with a central opening that dilated and contracted. They rotated, all of them moving in unison, tracking the camera as it hung suspended in the water. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Each one following the movement of the lights with deliberate precision. Eyes. Not like eyes, not analogous to eyes, but serving the same function, watching with an intelligence that was aware and focused and completely alien. The camera swung slightly on its cable. Every single growth rotated to follow the movement. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the desk to stop the tremor. The shape moved closer. Or maybe the current was pulling the camera toward it. Either way, the distance decreased. The floodlights illuminated more detail, textures that looked almost crystalline, structures that branched and divided according to mathematical principles I didn't recognize. The sound hit then. Low frequency, transmitted through the water and picked up by the camera's hydrophone array. The same sound Gregory had played in his office, but closer now. So much closer. The waveform spiked across the bottom of my screen. Communication. This thing was communicating. The winch cable went taut. I saw it on the tension readout. The gauge jumped from normal load to critical in half a second. The sound came again. Louder. Then the cable snapped. The sound was exactly like a gunshot. Sharp and immediate and final. The crack echoed across the water and through the wheelhouse, and I jerked back from the monitor as the video feed went black. The hull started vibrating beneath my feet. Not the normal engine rumble or wave slap, something else. A frequency I felt in my jaw first, then my teeth, then deep in my chest cavity, where it shouldn't reach. I looked down at the depth finder mounted beside the monitor. The numbers were climbing. 1,400 meters. 1,500. 1,600. I stared at the display. We'd been holding position in water that bottomed out past the sonar's range. The ocean floor wasn't rising. Nothing geological moved that fast. 1,700 meters. 1,800. My mouth went dry. Vernon. My voice came out flat. You seeing this? He was already moving toward the sonar display, hands leaving the wheel. Marilyn appeared in the wheelhouse doorway, hair loose from her ponytail and eyes locked on the screen. That's not possible, Vernon said. 1,900 meters. 2,000. The vibration intensified. Coffee in my abandoned mug rippled in concentric circles. The laptop screen flickered once, twice, then steadied. 2,100 meters. Every principle of marine biology I'd spent a decade studying said this couldn't happen. Nothing that size moved vertically through the water column at this speed. Whales surfaced gradually. Giant squid rose in pursuit of prey, but not like this. Not in a straight vertical ascent that registered on sonar as a solid mass occupying hundreds of meters of ocean. 2,300. It's coming up. I heard myself say it, heard how absurd it sounded. The vibration moved into my sternum, into my spine. Marilyn crossed herself. Her lips moved without sound. 2,600 meters. Vernon reached for the radio mounted above the helm, then stopped. His hand hovered over the receiver. Who would he call? What would he say? 2,800. I gripped the edge of the console. The metal felt cold under my palms, real and solid while the numbers kept climbing and my brain kept rejecting what they meant. 3,000 meters. The thing below us had risen over 30,000 feet in. I checked my watch, hands shaking enough that I had to hold my wrist steady. 4 minutes. Impossible. Physiologically, impossible. The pressure differential alone should have caused catastrophic tissue damage, nitrogen saturation, barotrauma, on a scale that would rupture every gas-filled cavity in a living body. But the swim bladders, the ruptured swim bladders in those fish. 3,200. We need to move. Marilyn's voice pitched high, words tight. Captain, we need to move now. Vernon didn't respond. He stood fixed at the sonar display, one hand braced against the console. 3,500. I looked past Vernon through the windscreen. The ocean surface stretched out in all directions. Dark water under overcast sky. Swells running 3 to 4 feet. Normal. Everything looked completely normal. 3,700. The vibration changed, deepened. I felt it in my molars now, a resonance that made my jaw ache. Vernon, Marilyn started. The ocean surface bulged. I saw it happen. Watched the water deform upward in a smooth dome maybe 200 yards off the starboard bow. Physics, I understood. Displacement, volume, fluid dynamics, but my brain couldn't process the scale, couldn't accept what the rising dome implied about the mass beneath it. "Brace!" Marilyn screamed. "Everyone brace!" The dome kept rising. Water sheeted off its surface, white foam against dark sea. The bulge climbed 10 feet, 15, 20. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The dome reached 30 feet, and something broke through. 17 seconds. That's how long the breach lasted. I know because later I checked my watch obsessively, trying to verify the timestamp, trying to make those 17 seconds fit into normal time instead of the stretched elastic eternity they felt like. The body that emerged wasn't octopus, wasn't whale, wasn't anything I had terminology for. Skin, if it was skin, in colors that shifted between deep purple and black and something that wasn't quite either. Surfaces that curved wrong, geometry my eyes couldn't track properly. I tried to find a head, a front, some bilateral symmetry my brain could anchor to. Nothing. The body kept rising, 30 feet of it, 40, 50, not quite serpentine, not quite radial. Segments or folds or sections that moved independently, sliding across each other with a fluidity that made my stomach lurch. I thought of cephalopod mantles, of whale flukes, of deep-sea fish with bodies adapted to crushing pressure. But this was none of those things. This was older. This predated the evolutionary branches that led to anything I'd studied. 60 feet. 70. The growths covered its surface. The same barnacle-like structures I'd seen on the monitor, each one the size of a dinner plate, maybe larger. Spherical bodies with central openings. They moved, all of them, independently. Each growth rotated on some kind of stalk or base, the central opening dilating and contracting. Not random, not reflexive. Tracking. Every single one turned toward the meridian. Toward us. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands across the visible body surface, all rotating in fluid synchronized motion until every opening faced our direction. Eyes. Not eyes. Something that served the same function but operated on principles I didn't recognize. Watching us with an attention that was worse than hostile, that was curious, analytical, measuring. My hands locked on the console edge. Metal bit into my palms. The creature hung suspended, most of its mass still submerged but enough visible to understand we were looking at something that shouldn't exist. That couldn't exist in any taxonomy I knew. Water poured off its surfaces. I heard the roar of it, tons of ocean sheeting away, heard Marilyn saying something in Spanish too fast for me to follow, heard Vernon's breathing harsh and rapid beside me. The growths dilated wider. The openings were dark inside. Not black, something darker, an absence that seemed to pull at my vision. Then it sank. The body descended as smoothly as it had risen, surfaces sliding back beneath the ocean surface with barely a ripple. Just gone, like it had never been there. The displaced water had to go somewhere. I saw the wave coming, a wall of green water maybe 15 feet high, broad and fast, displacement propagating outward from where the creature had breached. "Hold on!" Vernon lunged for the wheel. The wave hit the starboard bow. The meridian lifted. Not rolled. Lifted, stern dropping as the bow climbed, deck tilting past 30 degrees, past 45, the whole vessel rotating up and back like a toy boat in a bathtub. I lost my grip on the console, slid backward. My shoulder hit something hard. The bulkhead, the door frame. Couldn't tell, and I scrabbled for anything to hold. My fingers found a support rail and locked around it. The laptop slid past me, hit the aft wall with a crack of breaking plastic. Marilyn was on the deck, both arms wrapped around the base of the helm console, hair in her face and mouth open. Vernon had the wheel in a death grip, feet braced wide, keeping himself upright through pure upper body strength as the deck approached vertical. The boat hung there, suspended, everything loose in the wheelhouse sliding aft and a clatter of metal and equipment. I heard the hydrophone array I'd stowed below break free, heard it slam into something with a crash that meant broken components and destroyed data. Then we dropped. The bow crashed down into the trough behind the wave. The impact traveled through the hull, through the deck, through every bolt and weld in the Meridian's frame. The vessel shuddered, a deep structural groan of stressed metal that I felt in my bones. My grip on the rail tore loose. I hit the deck hard, left knee taking most of the impact, bright pain shooting up my femur. The boat shuddered again and again. Each impact of hull against water another hammer blow of deceleration and force. The waterproof drive sat in my palm. Hard plastic casing, about the size of a deck of cards, edges digging into my skin where I gripped it too tight. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Vernon had the wheel locked in a white-knuckle grip, every muscle in his forearm standing out in cords. He'd already spun us about, engines roaring at full throttle, bow cutting through swells at a speed that sent spray sheeting across the windscreen. The Meridian shuddered with each wave impact. Didn't matter. Vernon kept the throttle wide open. Behind us, the ocean where the creature had breached looked normal again. Smooth swells, gray water, overcast sky pressing down. No sign of what had just displaced enough water to nearly capsize us. The depth finder numbers were dropping. 2,800 meters, 2,600, 2,400. It was going back down. I watched those numbers fall and couldn't make my fingers loosen around the drive. The backup recording system had been hardwired into the camera's transmission feed, storing footage to this drive in real time before the cable snapped. Everything we'd seen at 35,000 feet, the massive body, the eye-like growths tracking our camera, the impossible geometry, all of it was here in my hand. Marilyn stood braced in the doorway, both hands locked on the frame, staring at nothing. Her lips were still moving. Couldn't hear what she was saying over the engine roar and the hull pounding through waves, but her eyes had that 1,000-yard look I'd seen once on a grad student who'd survived a riptide. "We clear?" Vernon's voice came out rough. He didn't turn from the windscreen. I looked at the depth finder. 1,800 meters. 1,600. "It's descending," I said. My own voice sounded thin. "Depth's dropping." Vernon didn't ease off the throttle. The vibration that had been shaking through the hull, that bone-deep frequency I'd felt in my jaw and sternum, was fading. Took me another 30 seconds to realize I couldn't feel it anymore, just the normal engine rumble and wave impacts. I checked my watch. The hands were still shaking, making it hard to read, but I managed. We'd been running full throttle for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Vernon finally eased back on the throttle. Not much, just enough that the Meridian stopped slamming quite so hard into each swell. He kept his eyes forward, kept both hands on the wheel, kept us moving east. Marilyn crossed herself one more time, then pushed off from the doorframe and moved to the port side. She grabbed a handrail and looked out at the water, not at us. Nobody spoke. The drive was slick with sweat from my palm. I loosened my grip just enough to keep from crushing it, then tucked it into my jacket's inner pocket and zipped the pocket shut. The weight of it pressed against my ribs. My shoulder throbbed where I'd hit the bulkhead during the wave. Gonna have a hell of a bruise. Didn't matter. We were moving, engines running, creature descending. That mattered. Vernon kept us at 3/4 throttle for another 20 minutes before he finally spoke. "Marilyn, check below." She nodded once and disappeared down the companionway without a word. I stayed in the wheelhouse, watching the depth finder and GPS and trying to get my breathing under control. The numbers kept climbing as we headed back toward shallower water. 1,400 meters, 1,200, 1,000. Marilyn's boots sounded on the ladder. She came back up with her face set in hard lines. Hull's cracked, she said. Forward compartment, starboard side, about 2 feet above the waterline. Seeping when we roll into swells. Vernon's jaw tightened, but he didn't look surprised. How bad? Bad enough. We can keep it above water if we don't push too hard and the weather holds. But we need to get back. Bilge pump? Running. Keeping up for now. Vernon nodded once, eyes still on the horizon. He eased back on the throttle another notch. The meridian settled into a steadier rhythm, engines thrumming lower, bow cutting through swells instead of battering them. 800 meters, 600. Continental shelf. Nobody said anything about what we'd seen. Marilyn went back below to monitor the crack. Vernon stayed at the wheel, hands locked, shoulders rigid. I stood in the wheelhouse with the drive pressing against my ribs and my mind trying to process what had just happened. The creature had risen from abyssal depths, had breached, had turned those eye growths toward us with that measuring, analytical attention. Then it had descended again. We'd lost the camera, lost the cable, cracked the hull, nearly capsized. But I had the footage. The trip back took 38 hours. Vernon kept us at reduced speed to spare the hull, taking a longer route through calmer waters. Marilyn rotated between monitoring the crack, running the bilge pump, and catching sleep in 2-hour shifts. I stayed mostly in the wheelhouse or on deck, watching the ocean and checking the drive every 20 minutes to make sure it was still secure in my pocket. The weather held. Overcast, light winds, moderate swells. If the crack had opened in rough seas, we'd have been in serious trouble. As it was, the seepage stayed manageable. Marilyn had to pump every 4 hours, but the compartment wasn't flooding. We didn't talk about the creature. Not once during those 38 hours. Vernon gave heading corrections and engine status updates. Marilyn reported bilge levels and pump cycles. I kept out of the way and didn't ask questions. On the second night, somewhere east of the continental shelf, with the nearest land still 100 miles out, I stood on deck watching stars break through gaps in the clouds. The ocean looked black and infinite. Somewhere behind us, 35,000 feet down in a trench deeper than most mountains are tall, that thing was down there. Doing what? I didn't know. Marilyn came up from below, checked the starboard rail where the camera winch still sat with its severed cable, then leaned against the rail 6 feet from me. "You gonna tell people?" she asked. Didn't look at me. Just stared out at the dark water. "I don't know," I said. "Good answer." She went back below. Vernon brought us into Seattle just after dawn on the second day. Pier 57 looked exactly the same as when we'd left. Weathered pilings, stacked crates, mourning gulls circling overhead. Felt like we'd been gone for months. Vernon cut the engines and Marilyn secured the lines. I gathered my gear, the cases with the recording equipment, the laptop that had broken during the wave, my personal bag. The drive stayed in my jacket pocket, zipped shut. Vernon met me on deck as I was hauling the last case up from below. "We're square on payment," he said. "But the hull repair's gonna cost. I'm gonna need another 3,000 to cover it." I'd burned through my savings chartering the Meridian and renting the camera. 3,000 more would clean me out completely. Checking account, emergency fund, everything. I set the case down. "I'll get it to you by end of week." Vernon studied me for a long moment. "You do that." He paused and rose. "Whatever you got on that drive, whatever you're planning to do with it, think real hard first." "I will." "No, you won't." Vernon's expression didn't change. "You got that look. Same one my brother had before he tried to summit Denali in winter. Didn't listen to anybody. Didn't come back either. I picked up my case. I'll get you the money. Vernon nodded once and turned back to his vessel. I walked down the pier with my equipment, my broken laptop, and the drive containing footage of something that shouldn't exist. My apartment looked exactly how I'd left it. Maps pinned to the walls showing 7 dead zones marked with red pins. Specimen photographs taped beside them. Coffee mugs on every flat surface. My desk buried under printouts of bathymetric charts. Gregory's waveform analyses. Tissue sample logs. I set my gear down by the door and pulled the drive from my pocket. The laptop was trashed, cracked screen, broken hinge, wouldn't power on. But I had my desktop in the corner. Old tower, 5 years out of date, but it had the ports I needed and a 27-inch monitor. I booted it up, plugged in the drive, and waited while the system recognized the device. 12 gigabytes of data, video files time-stamped with depth readings and hydrophone audio. The last file ended at 35,000, 42 feet, 3 seconds before the cable snapped. I opened the first file. Blue-green water, descending camera, shafts of sunlight. I skipped ahead. Darkness, floodlights illuminating marine snow. Depth reading, 28,000 feet. Skipped again. 32,000 feet. 34,000. 35,000. Then the massive object filled the frame. I stopped, took a breath, hit play. The footage was better than what I'd seen on the Meridian's small monitor. Higher resolution, more detail. The curved surfaces with their impossible angles were even more pronounced. The bioluminescent patches pulsed in complex patterns, wavelengths shifting from deep blue to violet, to colors I didn't have names for. The eye growths tracked the camera, each one rotating independently, stalks adjusting, openings dilating and contracting. The hydrophone waveform spiked. That low-frequency sound Gregory had matched to the bloop played through my speakers, and even compressed and filtered through recording equipment. It made my chest vibrate. The camera jerked. Tension gauge jumped. The image swung wildly, then went black. I sat back in my chair. Outside my window, Seattle was waking up. Traffic sounds, distant voices, the hum of the city going about its morning. Normal life. People getting coffee, heading to work, worrying about normal things. I restarted the footage. This time I went slower, frame by frame through the section where the object first appeared. I measured what I could see. Estimated diameter based on camera position and depth readings, counted visible eye growths, noted the branching structures and their geometric patterns. Nothing in my training prepared me for this. 12 years of marine biology, hundreds of dives, thousands of specimens examined. I knew body plans, knew evolutionary constraints, knew what was possible in deep ocean environments and what wasn't. This wasn't possible. I watched the footage 6 more times, took screenshots, made measurements, logged observations in a new document, tried to approach it analytically, scientifically, but my hands kept shaking and I had to keep pausing to breathe. Around noon, I made coffee, burned it because I forgot I'd already started a pot, drank it anyway, went back to the footage. I pulled up the breach recording next. The backup system had kept running after we'd lost the camera, capturing everything through the Meridian's hull-mounted hydrophone and the timestamp data. No video of the surface breach, but I had the audio, and I had my memory. I sat there in my apartment with burned coffee and watched the depth readings rise. 35,000 feet, 30,000, 25,000, 20,000. The hydrophone picked up movement, massive displacement, water pressure waves, 15,000 feet, 10,000, 5,000. I remembered standing in the wheelhouse, the vibration in my jaw, the depth finder numbers climbing impossibly fast, 2,000 feet, 1,500, the surface. I stopped the playback and stared at the screen. Then I restarted the breach footage from my memory. Not the data, my actual memory. What I'd seen through the Meridian's windscreen. The dome of water rising, the creature breaking through. 70 feet of impossible body, curved surfaces, purple-black coloration, the eye growths rotating to watch us, water pouring off its surfaces. I'd been terrified. We all had been. Marilyn praying, Vernon gripping the wheel, me holding onto the console while my analytical mind tried and failed to categorize what I was seeing. But now, sitting in my apartment 12 hours later with my heart rate finally back to normal, I could think clearly. I pulled up the depth data again, studied the ascent rate, calculated the time between when it started rising and when it breached. 17 minutes. 17 minutes to rise from 35,000 feet to the surface. I opened a new document and started writing. Ascent rate, depth intervals, timestamps. Then I added what I'd observed during the breach itself. Duration at surface, approximately 17 seconds. Behavior during breach, rose vertically, broke surface, remained stationary, then descended. No pursuit, no aggression, no attempt to approach the Meridian. The eye growths had tracked us, yes, but they'd tracked the camera too, down at 35,000 feet. Watching wasn't the same as attacking. I sat back and stared at my notes. The creature had risen 35,000 feet in 17 minutes, had breached, had stayed at the surface for 17 seconds, then had descended again. No chase, no pursuit. We'd fled at full throttle, and it hadn't followed. The depth readings had shown it going straight back down. Why surface at all? I pulled up images of the creature from the deep footage, zoomed in on the sections I could see most clearly, the curved surfaces, the segmented sections that slid independently, the branching structures. Then I noticed something I'd missed before. Along what might have been a lateral ridge, if this thing had anything resembling standard anatomy, there were regular openings, not the eye growths, different. Slitted structures, maybe 8 or 9 visible in the frame, each one roughly 2 feet across. I enhanced the image as much as the resolution allowed. The openings had edges that looked muscular, capable of contracting, and around each one the surface tissue showed striations. I knew those patterns, seen them 1,000 times in marine mammals, cetaceans, seals, respiratory structures. My hand stopped shaking. I pulled up the breach data again, studied the timeline, 17 minutes ascending, 17 seconds at the surface, immediate descent. Whales surfaced to breathe. Had to. Couldn't extract oxygen from water like fish. Needed atmospheric air. Deep-diving whales, sperm whales, beaked whales, could stay down for an hour, sometimes 2. Then they had to surface. Had to breathe. This thing had been at 35,000 feet, abyssal depths, pressure that would crush any organism I knew about, temperature barely above freezing. But it had surfaced, had broken through to open air, had stayed for 17 seconds, then gone back down. I stared at the screen and felt everything I'd been thinking rearrange itself. It hadn't been hunting us, hadn't been attacking, hadn't even been particularly interested in us beyond watching to see what we were. It had risen to the surface for the same reason every other air-breathing creature in the ocean rose to the surface. Because it needed to breathe. I sat in my apartment with burned coffee and 12 gigabytes of footage showing something that shouldn't exist, and understood that we'd done nothing except be in the wrong place when it came up for air. The dead zones, the ruptured swim bladders, the circular kill patterns, pressure trauma, barotrauma, something massive rising from abyssal depths, creating pressure waves that ruptured every swim bladder within a 2-mile radius. Not hunting, not attacking, just breathing. I looked at my notes, at the maps on my wall, at the 7 red pins marking dead zones. 7 times in 12 weeks. 7 breaths. The creature was still down there. Still alive. Still needing to surface every week and a half to fill whatever passed for its lungs with air. And nobody knew except me, Vernon, Marilyn, and Gregory. I saved my notes and closed the laptop. Outside my window, Seattle kept going about its day. I sat back from the monitor and pulled a notebook from the desk drawer. My hands were steadier now, 4 hours removed from solid ground, and I needed numbers. Not guesses or estimates. Actual calculations that would tell me what I'd seen down there. Depth first. The final timestamp read 35,042 feet. I converted to meters. 10,681. Wrote it down, underlined it twice. At that depth, the pressure would be roughly 475 atmospheres. 16,000 pounds per square inch, give or take. I'd dissected enough deep-sea specimens to know what that kind of pressure did to tissue, to gas-filled cavities, to anything with compressible structures. Most organisms at that depth were soft-bodied, gelatinous, no swim bladders, no lungs. But the thing I'd seen had breached. I replayed the breach footage frame by frame, counted the seconds it took for the body to clear the surface. 17 seconds of continuous emergence, curved sections sliding past each other, surfaces catching light before water sheeted off. I froze a frame, showing the widest visible span, and used the meridian's known beam, 12 feet, as a reference point to estimate scale. The creature had been at least 200 yards from the vessel when it breached. I adjusted for distance, for angle, for the curvature of the surfaces. The numbers didn't make sense the first time. I ran them again. Minimum length, 300 feet. Possibly more, depending on how much of the body remained submerged during the breach. I wrote that down too. Stared at it. Something 300 feet long, ascending from 10,000 meters, breaking the surface without apparent decompression trauma. No barotrauma. No ruptured tissues or hemorrhaging that would have left a slick of blood and body fluids across the water. It had surfaced clean, descended clean, moved with coordinated fluidity that suggested intact physiology and deliberate control. That meant it wasn't holding its breath during a dive. It lived down there. I pulled up a separate document on the desktop, started a new calculation. Metabolic requirements for an organism that size would be massive, even cold-blooded, even accounting for the near-freezing temperatures at depth and the reduced metabolic demands of deep-sea life. Something that large needed fuel. Oxygen. I sketched out rough estimates based on known giant organisms, blue whales, whale sharks, the largest squid specimens on record, all of them surface dwellers or mid-water hunters, all of them with access to oxygen-rich water or atmospheric air. The trench where we'd deployed the camera went deeper than our sonar could read. Deeper than 10,000 meters, certainly. The abyssal zone. Minimal oxygen. Minimal food sources. Nothing down there to sustain something that size unless it had adapted to near-total dormancy. I sat back, chewed the end of my pen. Dormancy would explain the metabolic puzzle. Lowered heart rate, reduced cellular activity, minimal oxygen consumption. Some species could do it. Certain sharks, deep-sea fish, even some amphibians. But those were small. Hours or days of reduced activity, maybe weeks. Not something measured in the timescales I was starting to consider. I checked the footage again. Paused on the frame showing the barnacle growths, the eye-like organs rotating on their stalks. Each one had tracked the camera independently but synchronously, a coordinated sensory array that suggested complex neural processing. I zoomed in until pixels blurred, The growths weren't parasitic. They were integrated, part of the organism's surface structure, embedded in the tissue, feeding off the same vascular system or whatever equivalent it used. That kind of complexity didn't evolve overnight. I opened a browser window, pulled up evolutionary timelines, cross-referenced body plans, phylogenetic development, the fossil record for large marine organisms. Everything I knew about evolutionary biology said that novel body structures, especially sensory organs that sophisticated, required millions of years of selective pressure and gradual adaptation. The thing I'd seen didn't match any known taxa, not even close. The geometry was wrong. The symmetry was wrong. The whole structural framework violated basic principles I'd learned in comparative anatomy, which meant either it had evolved along a completely separate line, isolated in the deep trenches where we'd never found it, or it predated the organisms we did know. I wrote down a number. 10 million years. Minimum. Conservative estimate for that level of morphological divergence. Then I crossed it out and wrote a bigger number. 50 million. Cross that out too. The ocean had been around for billions of years. Complex life for at least 500 million. If something that size, that different, had existed in the unmapped depths all that time, in a state of near total dormancy, we'd have no record of it. No fossils, no evidence. Just an unbroken stretch of deep time and deep water, silent and untouched, until someone dropped a camera into the wrong trench. Or until something woke it up. I closed the notebook, pushed back from the desk. My coffee had gone cold again. I drank it anyway, standing at the window with the mug in both hands, looking out at the street below where normal people were going about normal lives that didn't include things like this. The wall map was still up. I set the mug down and pulled the map off the wall, spread it flat on the desk beside the notebook, grabbed a pen and started annotating. Each dead zone got a number based on chronological order, 1 through 7. Beside each number I wrote the date it had appeared, pulled from my specimen logs. First dead zone, 9 weeks ago. Second, 6 days after the first. Third, 4 days after the second. The intervals were decreasing. I wrote down the dates for zones 4 through 7. 3 days, 2 days, 2 days again, 36 hours. My pen slowed. I pulled up Gregory's email, the one with the timestamps for the acoustic signals his decommissioned arrays had picked up. 17 signals over 12 weeks, he'd said. I copied the timestamps into a new document, converted them to dates, cross-referenced them with the dead zones. Every signal appeared 12 to 48 hours before a kill event. But the signals themselves were changing too. I opened the audio files Gregory had sent, pulled up the waveform displays. The first signal from 12 weeks ago had been faint. Low amplitude, short duration, barely distinguishable from background ocean noise. The second signal, 10 days later, was stronger, longer. The frequency modulation was more complex, the pattern more varied. By the 17th signal, 2 weeks ago, the waveform had tripled in amplitude, and the duration had increased from 8 seconds to nearly 30. I played the 17th signal through my desktop speakers, watched the waveform spike and fall. The sound was the same low-frequency sweep I'd heard in Gregory's office, the same pattern as the 1997 bloop, but louder, more insistent. The hydrophone recording from the camera descent had captured the same signal. I pulled that file, compared the waveforms side by side. Identical frequency, identical modulation pattern. But the amplitude from the trench, at 35,000 feet, was 10 times stronger than anything Gregory's arrays had picked up. I sat down slowly, eyes on the screen. Gregory had said the signals were communication. I'd agreed at the time because the variation in intervals and modulation suggested intentional structure, not random geological noise, but I hadn't thought past that, hadn't asked what it might be communicating, or to what. Now I had an answer. It had been calling, testing, sending signals into the deep water, into the unmapped trenches where the pressure was too high and the darkness too complete for us to follow. And something had answered. Not just one something. The dead zones were too widespread, too scattered across the continental shelf. If it was a single organism, it would have left a trail, a pattern of movement we could track. But the zones appeared randomly, 50 to 100 miles apart, no clear progression or directional trend. Unless it wasn't moving between sites, unless there were more of them. I pulled up the bathymetric charts, overlaid the dead zone locations and the abandoned submarine routes. Stared at the screen until my vision blurred, then refocused. The submarine routes had been abandoned 11 weeks ago. First dead zone appeared 9 weeks ago. 2 weeks between the Navy pulling out and the first kills. 2 weeks after something down there started waking up, and the Navy noticed. They'd run, rerouted their traffic, cleared out of the deep water corridors, stopped monitoring the old SOSUS arrays. They knew. Maybe not what it was, but they knew enough to stay away. And the thing in the trench, the thing we'd found, the thing that had breached and watched us with those rotating sensory growths, hadn't been hunting. It had been curious, slow, almost methodical in the way it surfaced and tracked the meridian before descending again. But the fish kills weren't slow. They were catastrophic. Thousands of fish, swim bladders ruptured by pressure trauma, all dead within a perfect circular boundary that suggested a single acoustic event radiating outward from a central point. The signals were getting stronger. The intervals were getting shorter. The kills were getting more frequent. Whatever had been dormant in those trenches, buried under miles of water and centuries of silence, wasn't dormant anymore. It was awake.